So hopefully you can all see a slide in front of you. Thank you very much for that introduction, John, and thanks for having me tonight. It's my genuine pleasure to be able to sit with you this evening and talk about climate change and how plants are responding. So the title tonight is Coping with Climate, How Our Changing Environment is Affecting Native Plants and Habitat Restoration in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. And so I'm going to draw from a whole bunch of different research by lots of different people, as well as some of the work we've done at IAE. But to kick it off, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about what we do in our organization. Our mission is to conserve native species and habitats through restoration, research, and education. And we have a vision that goes along with that, which is a world where all people and wild lands are healthy and interact positively, biological diversity flourishes, and environmental challenges are met with a social commitment to solving problems with science. We are a science-based organization, and we believe in using science. Logic can help us with our problems here. We work in a couple of different parts of this country. The primary area is in the Northwest. We're based in Corvallis, where we generally work in the Willamette Valley, coastal areas, as well as arid habitats on the east side of the mountains. In the Southwest, we have an office in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with about 5 staff members in it right now. And we do a lot there around rare species, but also promotion of seed and plant materials for restoration. So we have a big seed partnership there. In Oregon, we facilitate 2 different seed partnerships, one on the coast and one in the Willamette Valley. We also have some national projects with a broader footprint, like the Project Botany, which is a series of curricula, the Native Seed Network, and the National Native Seed Conference. This is a picture of our staff from before the pandemic, when we could all meet together. And this was a good time outdoors. So this is staff, friends, and family. So it's a lot of folks here. This is our board of directors currently. And we've got 10 people, and we were potentially looking for another board member. So if you're interested in serving in the governance of an organization like ours, I'd enjoy talking to you. We also use interns in the summer. So these are opportunities for young early career people to come and get experience doing conservation and research and decide if this is a field they want to go into. And the Native Plant Society of Oregon has been a major supporter of this internship program over the years. And we're very grateful to NPSO for annually, as a state level, providing about $3,000 to support these individuals. And this is not even a full list. So there are dozens and dozens of individuals who have come through this program, and many of which have gone on to more jobs or careers or graduate school in plant conservation. We work with endangered species. That's one of the areas that's in our wheelhouse, so to speak. And we have worked on the reintroductions of more than a dozen species at over 300 sites, where we take the seeds or plants and put them in the ground to establish new populations or augment existing ones. So this has been, a Sisyphean kind of task, yet we're making a difference. Some of the species we work on have actually been removed from the endangered species list, in part because of this work. And others are under consideration for either downlisting or delisting as well. So it works. When we do the research and we get behind this and put the effort in, we can make a very tangible difference. But we don't only work with plants. We work with butterflies, like the Taylor's checker spot butterfly, which is in Oregon and Washington and British Columbia. We work with the Fender's blue butterfly, which is an Oregon endemic, and the Oregon silver spot butterfly, again, an Oregon endemic. But also the monarch butterfly, which of course is not an Oregon endemic, but is across the continent. And of course, one of the things to think about when you're talking about butterfly conservation is that they require plants to complete their life cycles, not just as nectar sources, but as places where they lay their eggs and their caterpillars feed. And all 4 of these species are highly specific to either an individual plant species or a plant group. So if you're going to conserve butterflies, you have to conserve their plants. And you have to realize that butterflies are botanists. They're out there experiencing the world through a botanist lens. They're looking at the plants, they're identifying them, and they're tracking them down. We also do bird conservation. Some of the species we work on, the western meadowlark, the Oregon state bird, the streaked horned lark, the vesper sparrow, and the splendor-billed white-breasted nuthatch, which is really an obligate oak species. And we're very active in pollinator conservation, especially in the Willamette Valley, trying to understand what the major pollinators are in our prairies, for example. We've done a lot over the last 3 years with the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Land Management to enumerate what are the major pollinators, what is their identity, and what plants are they going to. And with this kind of information, we can put together plant pollinator networks where we're able to understand which plants are pollinated by which insects and where there's crossovers. So some insects are going to only one plant, but some are going to multiple plants. And some plants are supporting multiple insects. So it's a very kind of a complicated web, but we're trying to crack that nut and understand it a little better. We do a lot of habitat restoration. We get on the ground and we spray weeds, we light fires, we mow and we seed, and we do all these things so that we can get habitats restored. We have members, and our members are partners in this work. And with the support of people like you, you can make a difference by contributing to the work we do. And we're very grateful to every contribution, donation, in-kind, volunteer act, etc., that the community we work with provides. So now I'll shift gears and talk to you more specifically about climate change and native plants. This has been called the Anthropocene, this period of time we're living in, meaning the time of humans. We've changed the atmosphere. We've added carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere to the degree that we're heating the planet, we're changing the climate on the ground. So even though those are gases up high, they affect us down low. And the forecasts for what this is going to do to the climate in Oregon, these are some forecasts shown here, suggest some very substantial changes in the climate as measured through temperature and precipitation. By the end of this century, the temperature may exceed an 8 to 10 degree increase or even higher. And certainly after the summer we just had, it's not hard to believe that that's a real thing. It's really happening. When it comes to precipitation, the models that are out there are not in complete agreement and have a lot of uncertainty to them. And so you can look at the bottom graph and say, well, the models predict it'll either get wetter or drier, which perhaps isn't all that helpful because it's another way of saying, I don't know. You know, it's going to be wetter or drier. Well, yeah, for sure. But that doesn't tell us much. But what really is important here is that precipitation alone is not a very good predictor of moisture availability for plants. You have to combine that with temperature. And the bad news is that even if it gets wetter, it will likely be drier for plants because evapotranspiration will increase. And therefore, the amount of water available for plants will decline, even if there's more moisture, because it's evaporating, it's leaving the soil. If you look here at this map of Oregon and Washington and adjacent Idaho, you can see Salem over there. And one of the important things to realize is the amount of temperature increase that we expect is not uniform across Oregon or across the globe. It differs from place to place. And you can see there's kind of a east to west gradient here, so that in the east and southeast in Oregon, it's going to be hotter than it will be in, or the change in temperature will make it hotter there than in Western Oregon. And around Salem, we're talking about a more specific temperature change range of around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. So although that's still a lot, it's not quite as dramatic as it might be on the east side. Now, these kinds of dire warnings about the climate are at best depressing and at worst panic generating. And it's important to stop sometimes and think and talk about this together, that this kind of environmental degradation causes us stress. Not just the physical stress of it getting hotter or the degradation of our environment and what that does to it, but the psychological stress of seeing and knowing that our Earth is changing, and changing in ways that we might find bad and scary. We can think about a place like this, which is a nice, cool forest, and feel the impending doom of change, which is called, there's a name for it, solastalgia. This is essentially the anxiety and grief we feel for the degradation of our environment. And we can go from places like that cool forest to a pit mine at the extreme. But climate change is sort of all over everything. It doesn't have to be driven by a tractor. It's happening everywhere. It's like we're in the soup with climate change. And these damages and these destructions can feel personal. They can feel like individual arrows, like in this painting by Frida Kahlo called The Hunted, where she's depicting how it feels to see a piece of nature be damaged, as though it's a very intimate and personal feeling. Each one of these arrows feels like an arrow into one of us. And I just want us to stop and acknowledge that that is happening, and we feel it. And we may not feel like we can do anything about it, but there are some things we can do. We're not helpless in this. And I'm here to tell you that the more research we do and the more restoration we do, the better we can make this world. That said, there are more people than ever. And really, this is the root of the problem, is human population growth, of course. In 2008, the urban population exceeded the rural population for the first time on this planet. Our populations are growing, the population centers the most, and those population centers are expanding as well. This picture here is a picture of the globe showing an index of the human footprint. And you can see how much of the globe is just dramatically affected by people. So we are in a lot of places. We're not everybody, everywhere, but we have really changed this planet from the surface and in the atmosphere. So what does that mean for our flora right now? Well, if we talk about the IUCN red list, this is sort of a global list of endangered species, there are almost 14,000 near threatened to extinct plant species on that list. And almost certainly a terrible underestimate, but that's what we know about. That's about 4% of the world's plant species. In the United States, the threatened and endangered plants are about 939, and that's about 5% of our US flora. So a very similar degree if we look more locally there. And as a juxtaposition, I think it's interesting to point out that in the United States, about 20% of our flora is non-native introduced species, 20%. So 1/5 of the plant species that we see out there are introduced now. So what's happening with these plants during climate change? Well, a bunch of different things. First off, phenology. Now, this is from a study that was done looking at herbarium specimens in the Pacific Northwest. So this is local information. And these folks looked at herbarium specimens collected between 1901 and 2015. And they looked at the flowering dates on these specimens and then looked for patterns in change in flowering date. So one of the things they found was that plants growing on the maritime or low elevation areas tended to be having their bloom time increase, while plants growing in arid areas, like on the east side of the state, also showed that, but to a much less degree. So one of the things that's interesting here is that the change in phenology that we're witnessing is not the same everywhere. It's kind of complicated. And it also fits in with elevation. Those plants that are at low elevation are and maritime are creeping to earlier bloom dates faster than those species at higher elevations and in arid areas. So things are changing for plants now. They've changed over the last century already. And they're changing so that early bloomers are shifting earlier, low elevation maritime are shifting earlier, late bloomers are shifting earlier, but not as fast. Same with high elevation and arid plants. And the shift overall is about 4.4 days shift per 1 degree centigrade. So, we're seeing almost a week earlier blooming, just on average, through those herbarium specimens. So this is real change. It's already happened. Other people have looked at the effects on phenology in other parts of the country and found very similar results, and also found that it depends on the taxonomy or the plant group we're talking about, where orchids have a hard time tracking the climate, and therefore are going extinct more rapidly than other plants that are more labile and can shift with the climate. So there's a taxonomic component to this as well. Well, okay, how about another thing? Here we're talking about diversity. Diversity itself, just the number of species growing at sites, is in decline because of climate change. And I'm showing you a little bit from a study that was done in 2010, where some folks went back to ecological plots that were put in the Siskiyou Mountains by Robert Whitaker, who was a plant ecologist at Cornell University. But he came out to Oregon and wrote and did a lot of field work in the 50s and wrote some very seminal papers on plant ecology from that. But these guys went back to his plots that he'd put in the 1950s and resampled them to look for change and see what's happened in the period of time since he put those in. And what they found was a disturbing and dramatic decline in species diversity. And these were in sites that had not experienced a lot of disturbance from humans. There's some timber harvest there, but they avoided areas like that. So these differences, they posit, are really just due to the change in climate that has occurred since the 1950s. So some species are having a hard time keeping up with the climate change, and they're slipping out. But one of the interesting things that they learned here too was that there was species that had that were northern and endemic species. Those are the ones that are slipping off of this this pattern. They were kind of already at their range limit, or they're very rare. And then we're getting a shift to southern type and south facing communities. So in a way, the communities that were on south slopes are moving around to the north slopes, so that they're moving to an aspect that fits what those plants are adapted to. So some of these changes can be described in broad terms, but when you dig into it, they're kind of subtle and somewhat complicated. Then here's some more of that. Now, what happens to some of these species as their climate changes? And when we look at their population biology and understand how well their populations are at growing under these different conditions. The two species on the left-hand side of the screen, well, first off, this was a study done by some researchers at University of Oregon, and they set up some manipulative experiments where they put up heaters and structures to manipulate the precipitation in order to mimic what will happen during climate change. And they did this at multiple locations in Oregon and Washington. And here's some of what they found was that the species on the left were species that were, when they were moved beyond their northern rangeland, like these are Southern Oregon species that they moved further north. When they moved them further north and then heated them and dried them out artificially, they did great. In other words, when you made the northern habitats like the northern habitats in their future climate, when you made them like that, then the plants from the south did very well. So it's suggesting that these plants in the south may be declining in the south, but they'll do well as the climate warms if they're moved north. In the middle here, these are species that declined with heating and drought, but they grew better in the north than the south. So already their southern populations are starting to fade out, and their northern populations are doing well. But this is all within their current range. This isn't moving them at all beyond their range. So it does look dire for species like this. They're already fading out from their southern range, and when we make their northern range look like the climate's going to become, they start fading out there too. So this is a paper that makes, in my mind, a strong argument for thinking about how we conserve species genetically and through assisted migration, through movement. Because if we don't, they're gone. So trees may need to shift to survive and reproduce as well. So this study here by Monteleone and Lintz was done in Oregon, Washington, and California. Again, this is Pacific Northwest results. And what they found here, and I don't know on your screen, you might have to move the picture bar of our faces in order to see the graph on the right if you care about graphs. But what they looked at data from literally thousands and thousands of forest plots. And they asked the question, is there a connection between the abundance of adult trees and seedling trees with temperature? And what they found was yes, and that connection is different for seedlings and adult trees. And so in this case, what they showed was that of all the species they looked at, 33 of them, the seedlings prefer cooler temperatures than the adult trees. There were more seedlings where the temperatures were cooler than in the southern, generally hotter areas. So what this suggests really is that the adult at these southern hotter areas, the adult trees may be doing fine, but they're unable to reproduce. There are no seedlings. So that means that these adult trees are kind of just standing watch and perhaps hoping that the climate shifts back. But over time, they will die out eventually, and there will be no reproduction of those species at those sites. So these trees are facing a shift in their range, potentially. And how is that range shift going to happen? Well, it might be up to us. This is a study I'll talk about in a little bit of depth that's from some of the work we've done. And this is with a rare orchid species from Southern Oregon. It's actually a species that occurs in Southern Oregon and California, as well as Washington, Idaho, and Colorado. But we just looked at it in the Southern Oregon and Northern California area. And there's two species of Cypripedium or lady slipper orchid shown here. The fascicled, or I'm blanking on the common name of the Cypripedium. It's a lady slipper. And then the one on the right is Cypripedium montana, the mountain lady slipper. And the results I'm going to talk to you about are equivalent on both of these, but I'm only going to show you results from the Cypripedium fasciculatum study. And what we did here was, here's a little close-up picture of the plant. It's a cute one. And it occurs in conifer forests primarily, sometimes mixed conifer hardwood. And what we did was use an existing database and then augmenting it with our own field work to go back to populations of this species that have been found already and revisit them to find out if they're still present. And then we wanted to know, is there a connection between their likelihood of remaining there, or in the opposite, is their likelihood of going extinct, and any other variables we could use to explain that. And so we went to literally overall hundreds of populations of the species to document if they were still there or not. And what we found was that the likelihood of a population going extinct was related to three main things. The first was population size. Those populations that when they were first found were large were unlikely to go extinct over the course of this study. Those populations that were seen more recently were more likely to be there than populations that it had been a long time. In other words, the bigger the population and the more recently it was seen, the much more likely it'll still be there when we go back to look. And we looked at populations where the gap in time between when it was discovered and when it was revisited was between 1 and 29 years. So there's quite a range there. But also, this is really important, populations at higher elevations were much more likely to be surviving than populations at low elevation. Low elevation populations were likely to be extinct. And these weren't working, these were independently correlated. So each of these are drivers in what's going on. And when we take a model like that we develop to understand the likelihood of a population being extant or present on the landscape still, we could then apply that to the larger database that the federal government maintains on some of these sensitive species and ask, okay, out of the 1,000 or so populations of this species you've got in your database for Southern Oregon and California, how many are likely still there? And the answer is about half, only half. And this matters because this is an early warning that the populations of this orchid are slipping away from us. And that some of this may be due to climate change, because a loss of populations that's biased towards low elevations is an indicator that as the climate changes, those populations are more vulnerable than higher elevation populations where the climate hasn't changed as much. And you may think back to what we talked about phenology. This is similar to what we're seeing with phenological shifts. The low elevations are more sensitive than the high elevations. And finally, the database that the federal government maintains to say this is where there are sensitive species is wrong. It's, half of the populations that are thought to be there aren't, it appears. And if we're making decisions about how to manage our public lands based on faulty data, we're going to make faulty decisions. So we need better understanding of what's going on with more of these species and how that's affected by climate change or population size, et cetera. So we need to revisit many of these populations that have been in the database but haven't been checked for a decade or more. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the nuance that happens in populations when the climate is changing. So first off, this is a study with Astragalus thaiensis, or the Thai Valley milkvetch, species I've worked on for many years and accumulated a decade-long demographic data set. So we tracked individuals through time, seedlings, adult plants, everything, and understood their life history a lot better. We put out plots and the kind of habitat where the species occurs, and we return to them every year for over 10 years. And believe it or not, some of the people in this picture were NPSO interns, but from years gone by now. So Thai Valley milkfish. So first off, we took our data and we developed a population computer model. And with this model, we are able to look at some important pathways in the population growth of the species. And those pathways are survival from one year to the next, growth from one year to the next, and the reproduction that occurs from one year to the next. And that all together, we can kind of sum up and make a population model. We also looked at climate variables that occur in the spring and the summer and the fall and the winter, and use those to help explain what's going on from year to year in changes in survival, growth, and reproduction in the species. And so what we found is that there are significant correlations between say, the temperature, the maximum and minimum temperature in the winter, and survival of plants. We also found that rainfall in the summer was highly correlated with growth of plants as individuals. And then in the spring, the maximum temperature was strongly correlated with reproduction in this species. And these things all together really demonstrate that when we're talking about what does climate change, how does climate change affect a plant population? It's complicated. Different parts of our climate are affecting different parts of the life history of these species. And it's when we sum those up that we start understanding the overall effect of climate change on an individual species population dynamics. So we can take a model like this, where we understand the species life history, and we understand how weather variables or the climate is affecting those life history processes. And then we can take a model of future climate that's saying year by year, this is how the climate is going to change. And we can use that climate change as drivers for this model. So say, well, as rainfall changes, what will happen to growth? As temperature changes, what will happen to reproduction or survival, et cetera. And we sum those up at every time step in a model. And then we ask, what's going to happen? And what we're seeing is, for a species like the Thai Valley milkfetch, that overall, if we compare what's been going on in the past to what will happen in the future with climate change, that climate change actually might benefit this species slightly. It could reduce the risk of populations going extinct, which of course we didn't expect going into this. We just thought it would all be dire. But some of these species could actually benefit from climate change because the way their populations work and interact with these weather variables. But here's another example. This is with Snake River goldenweed. And I'll just show you briefly the results of that. This is, again, a decade-long study of demographic data of how plant populations work. We built a very similar kind of model and then projected it through time with climate change. And what we found in this case was that compared to the past, a climate changed future had a much poorer outlook for this species. The populations just dropped to zero and stayed there. While in the past, if we'd been able to keep that climate, population would likely grow. So we're seeing that climate change may have these complex effects on plants, but also it differs from species to species. And it's very difficult to predict yet from just looking at a species what this will really be. Now, here's yet another example of this kind of demographic 10-year-long data set, where we looked at Green's Mariposa lily. But in this case, we combined our experiment, well, our observations and experiment with looking at the effects of grazing by animals. And we've got cows in this picture, but we looked at grazing from all animals as well. So we built cages around patches of plants and then measured the demography of the plants inside, or we left them open and where animals could come and eat the plants. And here's what we did. So we built a computer model based on the life history of this species. And I'll point out in this case, dormancy is a part of the life cycle of this species. Sometimes the bulbs just stay underground for a year and don't even put up a leaf, so they go dormant. But otherwise, it's a similar structure of a model. There's survival, growth, and reproduction. And then we looked at the climate again. And what we found was that there were some variables, again, like summer conditions, fall conditions affected growth, spring conditions affected dormancy the following year, etc. And even fall conditions affected dormancy too. So it's a complicated life history and a complicated relationship with climate. And the top driver, the one thing that did the most was the minimum temperature in spring affecting dormancy. Interesting. That's such an important driver of the population's growth, is how plants cycle in and out of dormancy. But again, we could develop models that were from grazed and ungrazed environments, and then understand how climate change and land use management might interact to affect a population of a species like this. And so what we found was that in the presence of cows on the left, mostly populations were in decline, with or without climate change. But on the right, where we protected the populations with fences, we found that the population trajectory was reversed and the population started to grow. And climate change actually could become a positive and actually help the population. So how we manage these lands will likely affect the impact of climate change overall and through time. And that will likely differ from species to species. But it makes sense that as we stress these environments, as we stress plants with grazing, their resiliency to climate change could probably decline. So this is an intuitive result as well. So I'm going to head into the final phase of this talk tonight and talk about what we do in a restoration context with these species. So first off, how do we source plants for habitat restoration in a changing climate? Does it matter where we get the seeds that we put on the ground? I think you know where I'm going with this. First off, I'm going to talk about local adaptation and how important local adaptation is for plants. And then talk about future climate change and future climate analogs. And I'll explain what I mean by those in a minute. So this is a study we participated in with several other authors. And the idea was to look for the signature of local adaptation, genetic local adaptation in plants through common garden experiments. And a common garden experiment is where you take plants from different sources and you grow them in one common environment, generally a field plot of some kind. And in these kinds of experiments, you can then try to understand how does the source population's normal climate affect how well it does in this common garden and how that differs from species to species or populations to populations. But our big question was, is there local adaptation? Is that common or not? And we looked for 3 signatures to find out and demonstrate if local adaptation is a common thing. And the first is there variation among populations in how well they do in a common garden? And the answer is a resounding yes. 95% of 305 studies found variation from population to population. Now, this is the grist of evolution, right? This is the variation that is needed to make it so populations can succeed or not in the environment. So this makes sense. Sort of almost, we kind of knew this, but it was the strength of this signal was kind of mind-boggling. But then the next question is, does that variation correlate with the environment? And that's where local adaptations really come into play. Not just do they differ from place to place, but is the environment driving that local adaptation or that difference? And 86% of 161 studies found that, yes, that there was trait by environment variation. And of those, 75% were driven by climate alone. Climate explained 75% of the variation in populations of these species across all of these studies. So yes, it appears to be local adaptation, and it's a climate-driven game. Then we had very fewer studies to ask this final question, but we persevered and got significant results. And the last part was, is there a local advantage? Did the population that was the most local to the common garden fare better than populations from more distant locations? And the answer was yes. 2/3 of the studies found that survival was improved for the local source, and 90% found that flowering was improved from the local source. So taken together, this is strong evidence that local adaptation is the rule, and that climate is an important factor in selection that leads to this local adaptation. So that said, then here's another result from a different study. These are folks on the right is a map made by some folks at the Chicago Botanic Garden and Northwestern University who are studying climate envelope modeling. So what they did was say, okay, if a population occurs in an area and you draw a circle around that that sort of epitomize its climate, where is that climate likely to go in the future? Where is their climate envelope likely to move as climates change? And what they found was very fascinating, that on the eastern United States, populations are generally forecasted, the climates of species are generally moving northward, which is kind of what we expect. But in the West, it's a scramble. Some are going north, some are going south, some are going east, west, whatever. And that's largely driven by the fact that in the East, the topography is generally flat. But in the West, we have mountains. We've got lots of mountain ranges. And so elevation is complicating the story. It's not just north and south, it's up as well. That's an important result. So the changing climate means that the optimal environment for these species is likely to shift. And so what do we do in a restoration context? If the climate is moving out from under these species and we're trying to restore them and their habitat, what do we do? So one approach is when we're doing restorations with seeds, for example, we can either keep the seeds strictly local, like we never move them. We think the local stuff is best and we're going to keep them there. And that is the tradition in restoration. Or we can have some different approaches, like a relaxed local, meaning we mix a few local sites. We make a composite mix of a strategic grouping of regional samples. We make an admixture, which is a range-wide mix, just to go to every population in the species or throughout its range anyway, and mix them all up and throw them on the ground and let nature decide. Or we could do something which might be a predictive approach, where we match the seed source to the future climate of the site. So and that's where we get into future climate analogs. So in the Willamette Valley, this is what we've been doing, is composite mixes, where we go throughout the range of the species in the Willamette Valley, and we collect seeds, and then we grow those all together in one farm, and then harvest the seed that has now become a mix of lots of populations. So that's our in a nutshell, our main approach to try to maximize the genetic diversity of these populations, and therefore give the site and the climate a lot of genes and combinations of genes to choose from. Okay, great. We've been happy with that. But it doesn't necessarily address the degree to which climates are changing. So another approach is captured in a web tool called the Climate Smart Seedlot Selection Tool. And the idea here is you can point out on a map where your restoration site is, and then ask this computer algorithm with all this information about climate change modeling in it, where on the landscape is the climate that my site will become in, say, mid-century today? Where today should I get the seeds for my climate tomorrow? And so you can map that in here and say, oh, well, if I'm going to be in the Portland area, I'm going to have to go down to the Umpqua Basin to get seeds of plants that are adapted to my future climate. So it's that kind of thinking. So instead of just like taking a whole bunch of seeds and just piling them all together and seeing what happens, it's a much more strategic approach. Let's see. And so this identifies locations from which seeds may be moved to the new site to match that site's future climate. And the user specifies the past or future climate scenario. And so this tool, the benefit of it is it's highly flexible, and the downside to it is it's highly flexible. which means that you need to have some understanding of which climate variables you want to use in the model, because it allows you to specify all kinds of different variables, and you'll get different answers if you put in different variables. So you have to have some background and some idea of what you want to do. But it's a pretty cool website, and you can go play with it yourself. It's open out there. But here's a specific example from using that tool. So this comes from a project we're working on with the group called Clean Water Services. And these are water providers for for the public in the Portland area. They are very interested in restoring riparian conditions, because when they pull water out of the rivers, they need to have a permit, and that permit requires them to maintain water temperatures that are low enough. And so they're planting trees and actively and aggressively managing riparian conditions and other surrounding vegetation to the rivers. Also, the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District works a lot with landowners in the same area, and they want to know what to plant, what's going to grow well in the long term. So we've been working with both of these organizations to try to ask, especially around woody plants, but not exclusively. We're looking at some forests too. Where should we be getting the plant materials for planting in this area, especially right along the Tualatin River? And we can use that climate smart seed lot selection tool and ask, well, where on the landscape is the climate for mid-century, the 2041 to 2070, of the Tualatin Basin? And you can see on the left, I hope, that there are different shadings, and the oranger it is, the better the match. And what's surprising here in some ways is that it's not only Southern Oregon, or the Umpqua Basin in particular, that you might want to go to, but all the way down into the Redding area, and then inland from the coast in California, that same latitude. So we may want to be collecting plant materials for use in the Tualatin, especially for things like trees that are going to take a while to mature, have a longer life cycle. Now, we may need to go there now in order to establish vegetation that will be resilient to climate change. And if we look later in the century, in the 2071 to 2100 range, we don't even want to look in Oregon at all. We want to look in that Northern California only. Now, this is just a model. It's probably wrong to some degree, but it's a way for us to become more strategic and consider these options. And we're working with these groups in the Tualatin area now to think about performing a common garden experiment ourselves to understand which of these sources out there, if we go into Southern Oregon or Northern California, if we collect plant materials from all of those areas of the same species and plant them together, can we see differences already? And can we correlate those differences with the climate so that we can make a very strategic move towards a successful and resilient riparian vegetation for the long term? So that's one direction we're going with this. So that that sometimes can bring up some very interesting questions, because if we go down to Northern California, we may actually encounter species that don't currently grow along the Tualatin River. But we're not just interested in moving the genes of the species that occur throughout that area, but we may want to consider moving whole species to the northern area that don't occur there yet. So we're trying to keep an open mind about what might work and experiment with it, and before getting into something more whole hog. But even when we do a genetic admixture, what we're talking about is not just replacing the northern genotypes with southern genotypes, but adding the southern genotypes to the population so that they can blend in and add their genes to the needed diversity for adapting to climate change. Because there's going to be more differences than just climate. There's soils, there's hydrology that will come into play. So those local genotypes are still important. And so we may be talking about moving in, a 20% mixture of genes from somewhere else. rather than just let's drop the local and only do the distant. So we're trying to be quite judicious about this. So with that, I want to conclude and say thank you for sitting through this talk on how plants are coping with climate and how that might affect where our native flora is going in the future, and how we might look at restoration of these habitats and these species in the long term. So thank you very much, and I hope this has given you food for thought.
Great, thanks, Tom. I'm going to open us up for questions, and I'm going to start. And just raise your hands. No one's in the chat room. So I'm going to start with 3 questions, Tom. One is the effect of maximum temperature, extreme temperatures, rather than a general increase in average temperatures. Data point of 1 is it was 117 degrees in Salem and just creamed half of our native plants in our garden. And no matter what I could do. And I assume that there's a difference between, the effect of average temperatures but we're going to see these extreme temperatures. Yeah. And I was just wondering if there's research there of the impact of extreme temperatures as opposed to an increase in average temperatures.
Well, I think your point and your question is spot on, and matches my experience too. Most of the research is using averages to look at how are things going to be, but we know that it's those extremes that test species, right? They really push them over the edge. There was a study done, I think in the 1970s, on saguaro cactus that found that saguaro cactus range limit is controlled by frost, but frost may be rare in that environment, so it's an extreme. In the meantime, you might be able to plant saguaro in northern places and they do great for a while, but then that extreme event hits and limits them. So I think we've got a lot to do and think about with those extremes. But I witnessed exactly what you're talking about this year too.
2 other quick questions. One, are there any restoration for projects for at-risk plants where the restoration project is outside their current range?
I don't know of any in the Pacific Northwest at this time. Maybe 10 years ago, I started talking about this. We should try this. We should do this. Willamette daisy is a Willamette Valley endemic. Right. Maybe we should be thinking about incorporating it into some restorations in Puget Sound prairies. And oh my God, it's an endangered species, so it's protected under the Endangered Species Act, and you'd need to get a permit from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the answer was no, hell no. But I think that kind of perspective may be changing as we realize just how fast and dire these changes seem to be happening.
I'm going to say my 3rd question. We have one from Ashlyn. Are you collecting seeds from these hypothetical sites in California yet?
No, but we plan to. But the next step will be to go through the data that were collected this year to characterize the communities in those areas, so we understand what the relative species mix is, as well as what species are doing well and where. We'll go through those data and then say, okay, here are our top recommendations for, say, 20 species to work with. And then the phase will go into perhaps collecting those plant materials and then putting them into experimental gardens.
Follow-up question. Is there a time limit from collecting from those areas because the environment is changing, those species may be declining?
Say that again? I'm not sure.
Is there a time limit for collecting from those areas because the environment is changing and those species may be declining?
Fair question. I think yeah, we want to act now, but I think our hope is that if we're going to those southern populations, that they might be more resilient for longer, but we don't know that. That's an excellent question. They may be vulnerable there, and they may need that lift to the northern habitat sooner than later. Great question.
We got one from Catherine. What would a good citizen science project related to climate change and plant species that elementary age students can do at a place like a state park in Western Oregon over a period of years or multiple years?
I would look at Project Budburst, which is a a citizen science program that I think is currently managed by the Chicago Botanic Garden. I think they took it over from the NEON, the National Ecological Observer Network. And so the idea is to look at dates of bud expansion or flowering, et cetera, of species in your area, and then you report those to a larger database. And then we can start tracking phenological changes over huge areas.
Okay.
So that's one that comes to mind.
Yeah. I'm going to now throw in my third question, and while other people are thinking about questions, is there some mega organization? I mean, I know IEDA is doing amazing work in restoration. You raise a lot of issues in your talk. Is there a mega organization where all the Tom Kays are getting together to talk about a research agenda, or talking about a restoration agenda?
Well, I think that's happening at a lot of levels. There are national societies like the Ecological Society of America, the Society for Ecological Restoration, on whose board I serve, the Natural Areas Association, groups like that are very keenly aware of these issues and want to bring these issues into the norm, and so that practitioners are aware of them and putting them into practice. So, yes, and I think we probably have more to do on, I don't think there's a national society for climate change restoration,
Right.
That's specific. But so yes, but there's, we've got a lot more communicating to do.
Yeah. Any other questions? You can just sort of pop in.
I just sort of a question or a comment. Just looking at some of the sites in Northern California, I realized it's where they were all burnt this year. I'm just thinking the Sierra Nevadas there, and looking at what's coming back here after the burns, it's different species. And I was just wondering how, and I don't know if there's any information on what happens after a fire, the way the ecology changes, because I'm sort of tracking in a couple of places that burnt up in Santiam that I'm seeing species that I didn't see before. And just if you want to collect in some of those sites, would it have changed if a fire had gone through? I'm thinking the Dixie fire.
That's a great point. And, as someone else asked, is there a time limit? And that time limit might be driven more by fire, which is kind of an indirect effect of climate change on these sites. And certainly when the field work was happening this year, we didn't do that field work, but when other people were doing it, they had to kind of pick sites based on where they hadn't burned yet or recently. So yes, those fires are vast and causing large landscape change. And I mean, it really just brings up another point, which is when climate changes, maybe we can make a model of a plant, how weather variables are likely to affect it and it'll grow or not. But it's those indirect effects that are hard to predict, maybe impossible to predict, that could be huge drivers in all of this. Like the temperature may cause stress on the plant and make it more vulnerable to disease. And we didn't see that disease coming. Or all of a sudden there's a new invasive species, or there's an animal that does really well, like mice, and they eat all the seeds, or these things that we thought it was going to go one way and zoop, it goes another, because the world's complicated and hard to predict.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thanks for letting me go on my damn.
So we got Becky. What should the average native plant focused homeowner do to plan ahead for climate change? And then I'm going to have some follow-up questions after your answer to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're kind of in uncharted territory. As you mentioned, John, the heat dome killed or at least damaged maybe half the native plants in the yard. Who knew, right? I mean, none of us really saw that coming. So I think I would just fall back to perhaps the premise of using native plants and using a diversity of them in your garden. And I'm a huge proponent of diversity of species. And perhaps now we need to be thinking also diversity of genotypes, even of the same species. That can be very fun to grow in your garden and see how plants from different areas do. But it also could give you some resiliency in ways that you might not predict in your garden. So your plants do well over time.
I have a lengthy question here. Let me start with Rose, and then I go back to the lengthy question. What are you learning about climate adaptation or climate mitigation from our tribes of this region?
That's a wonderful question. Thanks for asking that. And I think I am all ears essentially on that. And I don't know the answer from I haven't heard that answer from tribes yet. I've paid a lot more attention to traditional ecological knowledge around fire and other kinds of disturbances and land use management. But climate change is different, and I just haven't heard a lot yet. So Rose, do you want to chime in?
I would just love to speak with you further. I've been thinking about you for a long time, Tom. I've been so darn busy, I haven't been able to get it back in touch. But you know,
Likewise,
there's a lot of networks, a lot of native networks, a lot of fabulous work being done of tribes consulting together. I notice how they do welcome, you know, non-native participants, particularly from the government and research, you know, institutions. And so I think there's a lot to be shared. I just keep waiting for more and more of our science community to acknowledge, you know, honor and acknowledge some of the wisdom of the tribes. We are, of course, scrambling to survive at this point, but I'm really interested, and I'm studying, and I'm training a group of people right now in traditional ecological knowledge, and you know, maybe we can talk further down the road. I think there's a lot that could be shared, and you know, you're so eloquent, you really resort to a lot of the important science knowledge that we really respect. And I think, you know, it's a great combination to include the elder wisdom along with the, you know, the science that is gradually expanding with regard to all these serious issues. So thank you.
well, thank you. That was very well put, and I appreciate the invitation. And Rose, let's try to connect again soon, okay?
So we have two more questions. I'm going to sort of end it there. One is, I'm going to sort of paraphrase this from Mary Hayden of that we're not only disrupting the carbon cycle, but we're disrupting the hydrological cycle. And so that if all the carbon could be removed from the atmosphere, we'll be far from solving the warming problem until we restore water back to the landscape, according to Mary. They should, so basically they advocate restoring forest and vegetation cover aggressively to recreate the absorbent sponge layers that preserve water on the land. Have you heard of this?
Sure. Getting organic matter back on the soil and getting trees to shade the ground are important steps. Absolutely. And getting water back in streams so that water can rehydrate the water tables is huge. Unfortunately, as we all know, I think the battle over water is hardly over and is only going to intensify as water becomes more scarce. And as I mentioned, I think early on in the talk, even if it gets wetter, it will get drier. That's the harsh, ironic reality that we face. But I very much appreciate that comment about returning water into streams, getting organic layers on the ground. It's really important to protect our soil and help retain what moisture we do have.
Okay, so last question for you. You mentioned the problem early in your talk about the problem of tree seedlings being negatively impacted by climate change regeneration. Do you have any suggestions for helping seedlings survive?
Well, is that in the context of the wildlands or garden? I'm wondering, but so, you know, in a garden, I think we can do things like, you know, provide more water and perhaps shade for early part of their life to get them established, because it's that early root system development that's probably most vulnerable. In wildlands, I'm at a loss at this point because the whole climate has changed out from under these species. And unless we can bring down the CO2 content and other greenhouse gas content in our atmosphere, it's hard to imagine the climate going back to what it was. So if one way to talk about it is the way you protect those seedlings is to help them grow in a better place for themselves.
Well, thank you again, Tom. This is amazing, wonderful presentation. I learned, you know, I think all of us learned a lot, and we thank you. I just want to make a pitch for the wonderful work that IAE does. And I know there's many worthy organizations out to donate to. It's one of them, definitely. So particularly for native
Thank you,
plant
John.
lovers.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
thank
well,
you, Tom.
We work with lots of things, plants, animals, butterflies,
Yeah.
whatever, but I'm a botanist, so I talk
Yeah.
about that stuff. Thank you. Thank you very much for